And welcome everyone to Everyday Conversations, our podcast for faith beyond belief. We're so glad, hopefully, we're already a few minutes late here to get this to work. And we're so glad to be able to do this live podcast. We can take live questions from those who sent questions earlier. So we're actually really excited to get this kind of training available. I'm really excited to get a special guest as well, introduce him shortly. One of the reasons why we exist as a ministry is we really strongly believe that it's our job as Christians to train people to be effective ambassadors for Christ in everyday conversations. And our job isn't to be the most intellectual, powerful apologetics ministry, but to make sure we empower you as our listeners, as our friends in your everyday conversations and ordinary walks of life. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited to have Detective Jim Wallace with us today, because his new book, Person of Interest, really speaks to his skill set and how he's using it to train people to be ambassadors for Christ. So, Jim, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, glad to be with you. You're absolutely right about this idea of all of us having to step up, right? I kind of feel like that's the goal for each of us who's kind of in this content consumption mode that we're in, right? Where we're all kind of consuming content online, YouTube, videos, Facebook. And how do you shift toward content creation, right? Where you're actually interacting in the conversation, not just consuming. So yeah, it's fun to do with you.
I mean, I love the theologians. I love reading them, but my
Yep.
dad's a pastor, so it's great to have trained Christian leaders who work in this area. Heather, our new executive director, is also a pastoral background. But the point is, not everyone can get that training, but everyone has a job to do. And this
Yeah.
is what I love about your new book, Person of Interest. So maybe Jim, just to catch people up, just in case they don't know you, even though we've had you up here in Calgary.
Yeah.
What's your background and how did you apply your skill set to this great book in this endeavor?
Well, I mean, my background was that I was not raised in the church, had no interest in the church. I was with my wife for about 18 years. We were together before we ever attended a church. I didn't even really, can't remember, not recall having a conversation with her really about these issues because it wasn't a part of my life. But when we had kids, it became something that Susie was even more, she always, I think, always believed that there was a God. Never really had a conversation with me about those kinds of things. I think maybe she just assumed, hey, doesn't everyone believe there's a God of some sort? Now, I was pretty committed as a naturalist. I would have rejected anything supernatural, rejected miracles, rejected the existence of anything beyond the material world. Really was committed to sciences. I didn't think that there was any reason to even examine this, but she was persistent enough to get me to go to church with her. And I was happy to go as a non-believer. That's something my dad has always done. Continues to do. We'll be happy to go to church with you. If you want to go to church, he thinks that a world in which there are believers is better than a world in which there are no believers. He thinks that a world actually that's governed by a Christian worldview is better than a world that's not governed by a Christian worldview.
I want to come back to that. That's a good
Yeah,
point.
yeah. He thinks that it's all fiction, but he thinks that it's useful fiction. And so that was my view. And I was more than happy to go in order to kind of hold that view. But the problem was I got interested in Jesus because the pastor said he was smart. As a matter of fact, he said he was the smartest man who ever lived. And I wanted to see if that was true. And so I bought a Bible that's sitting on my shelf back here, a pew Bible, and I just started kind of going through it to see what the red letters were. What is so smart about Jesus of Nazareth? And I was working as a detective at the time. And I knew how to at least parse out. Most of my career was spent really working cold cases. But, when you first start as a patrol officer, I worked in SWAT. I worked in gangs for 2 years. I worked in the undercover position for 4 years. I worked doing street dope. And then I was assigned to robbery homicide and eventually ended up working homicides, working cold case, unsolved homicides. So I understood how to assess eyewitness testimony, which I did. And that's in a book called Cold Case Christianity, where I'm really assessing the Gospels. Yeah, I hope that that's helpful to people. But this book is different because this book looks at everything that's outside the New Testament. And here's the analogy I use. When you have a nobody murder, and I've had a number of these, that's where like a business partner will kill his associate, or a wife will kill her husband, or a husband will kill his wife. And he'll claim that they had an argument the night before and that she just ran off. And I don't know where she went, and then, you've got no body. He disposes of the body successfully enough that it's never recovered. This thing goes years, and then maybe sometimes I have one that's 3 decades, and before anyone really opened the case. And we opened it and looked at the case, and we have no body, no evidence from a crime scene. They never took a report for a murder. It's just a missing persons. So what do you do when you've got no evidence at the crime scene? Well, you tell the jury, I'm going to tell you what happened on the day she went missing, because I believe it was an explosion of anger. And I'm going to demonstrate that by tracing every bomb has a fuse that burns toward the explosion of the bomb. And after the bomb explodes, you got debris everywhere. So I'm going to demonstrate from the fuse and the fallout what happened on the day she went missing. Well, a similar approach you could take with the Gospels. If you don't want to read the Gospels, if you imagine a scenario in which every New Testament Gospel had been utterly destroyed, you could still reconstruct the story of Jesus from just the fuse and fallout of history. And the way you can reconstruct it is so remarkable that it does speak, I think, in my view, to his historicity and deity. And that's one of the things we're trying to do in Person of Interest, looking at imagining a world in which there's no New Testament and asking the question, what could you know about Jesus from just the fuse and the fallout?
And just to clarify, because there's been a popular atheist in our community who's tried to review the book, and to be fair, he hadn't read it at the time; it wasn't released. But based on the interviews you've done at that until that point, he said you're basically arguing that Christianity is true because it became popular and was copied. That
Right.
isn't what you're saying, though, right?
No, I mean, you could kind of argue the same way. It matters. Look, Jesus doesn't matter because of his impact. He had impact because he mattered. It's just the opposite. And if you're looking for an example of why this is the case, and it's demonstrably so, then just ask yourself, I mean, first of all, you have to be aware of the kind of impact that Jesus had. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But if you think there's another fictional character in the history of fictional characters who's ever had that kind of impact, show me who it is. Because I'm not talking about just, oh, he's popular. I mean that he has changed history and formed the foundation of the most important aspects of human culture. Art, music, literature, science, education, and all the other world religions all hat tip Jesus. They don't hat tip, Luke Skywalker or, Peter Pan or any fictional characters. Look, if you can't find an example of a fictional character that's had the kind of impact that Jesus has, I think it's a reasonable inference that Jesus is something more than a fictional character. But it's worse than that, because you won't also find evidence that any other mortal human on the planet has had the kind of impact of Jesus. And that's why it's reasonable to infer that Jesus is more than another mortal. Now, let me just say one last thing about it.
Sure, of course, yeah.
If you look at what popularity can bring, I have a list in the last chapter of all of the primary figures, the most important historical figures of the first century. If you're wondering why we call the first century, well, you could look at everybody else who ever lived in the first century who mattered, who was, and all of them on my list are far by tenfold more popular than Jesus was in that first century.
Right. Yeah.
They were emperors. They were world leaders. They were poets. They
had power and influence.
That's right. And none of them changed history like Jesus. And none of their stories can be reconstructed from the nooks and crannies of all of those aspects of human culture. Right. Yet Jesus can be reconstructed from music, art, literature, education, and science. And he can even be reconstructed from the non-Christian religions, many of whom include Jesus on their holy scriptures. So I think this is why this kind of impact is so bizarrely outsized that you have to kind of ask yourself, how could this be, given the meager upbringing, the meager beginnings of Jesus of Nazareth, right? That's what we're trying to do in this book, is to not just show you the kind of impact which you will not find paralleled in any other figure, but also to show you how much of the Jesus story can be recovered from the actual areas of impact.
Right. Well, one of the interesting points that this atheist made was, Jesus could have come during the time of the internet, or during the time of VCRs, or during the time of, during the printing press. And I just thought about that. Well, isn't the point that you're making is none of those inventions could have happened unless Jesus created the Western culture in the first place.
That's right. So it's so funny. You're putting the cart before the horse. You're saying, well, hey, why couldn't he have come after these things that came from his influence were here? So the problem, of course, is that there's two things about that. Number one, three things. Number one, what you just said. It turns out that the progress of science and technology, even computer languages and computer search, look at all the founding fathers of those disciplines. The vast majority of the founding fathers of everything in science, including quantum mechanics, all the way to computer languages, the vast majority are Christ followers who are working under a Christian worldview,
or even
which ignited But yeah, ignited the sciences in Christendom in Europe, even though
Right.
there were far more people outside of Christendom and
Right.
outside of Europe. That's not where it began. It began in Europe under Christendom. So that's number one. Number two is that I'm not so sure that this would be a better time, just in the noisy kind of world it is, with all of the doubt and polarization we're experiencing right now. It's not that social media has brought us together to look at facts. No, it's
Mhm.
polarized us into tribes where we doubt each other's claims. And that's not the kind of environment that I think anyone wants to try to make a breakthrough. And by the way, if you're thinking, well, I could just record miracles, how many things online have you seen that you doubt? Even though
Right.
they seem, oh, it's very convincing. No, you
Right.
don't trust any of it, right? Because
Right.
it's all computer graphics. This is a third thing. And this is the thing that I think people underestimate. And that is that in this world we're in right now, I learned this from research in the book, is that let's say you have a video, this video, we put it on YouTube and it goes viral, let's say it does. And let's say it gets 100,000 views.
Mhm.
Well, those people are not going to download it. You're not going to get 100,000 downloads. You're going to get 100,000 views.
Right.
This technology does not take up geographic space. But the technology of the first century communicating the truth about Jesus was written in manuscript evidence. And those things took up. So, for example, if I sell 100,000 copies of Person of Interest,
Mhm.
it'll find itself in 100,000 different geographic locations around the planet. That is
Right.
a much harder piece of material now to destroy. You'd have to know everywhere the book exists, not just a switch on a server would it eliminate the video. And by the way, the technology is going to change. That's
Mhm.
another thing you have to think about. Do you remember when Palm Pilots were the bomb? I used to
Yeah.
have a Palm
I
Pilot
had
before I
one.
had my phone. Right.
Yeah.
Well, that data I originally I exported it,
Yeah.
but no one's reading those extensions.
Right.
That's not even recoverable anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the same thing is true for VHS tapes. By the
Right.
way, I don't know, last 3 laptops I purchased, do they have a DVD drive?
No.
No, they used to. So how do we even deliver these things anymore? That technology is changing so quickly, but it turns out that the most reliable, trustworthy source of technology for communication still is the printed word.
Right.
And it survives over the ages. It survives over the millennia.
Mhm.
And it doesn't change significantly, so we can still recover the data.
Right.
So there's the difference, I think.
No,
It's
and
not just that, it's that these things don't date, right? So if you were to watch the videos of C.S. Lewis during World War II or after World War II, discussing the very material that is in Mere Christianity, because he did those as radio shows.
yes.
If you were to watch that, you go, that's like ancient. But if you read it, it seems very evergreen. It
True.
turns out that there's some advantage to the written word that actually helps to communicate an evergreen concept over the millennia.
Well, and I think that that's what I wanted to say at the start as well, is to reemphasize that the concept of apologetics nowadays is different, not because the content is different, but because we are enveloped with information that's from a variety of different sources, and it's frustrating, as you probably have had conversations with kids who grew up in church who leave the faith because they watched a YouTube video, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
so it's so critical for us to communicate these thoughts and ideas in ways that as clear as possible, to be able to address those concerns, but to be focused really on what's critical. And that's what I love about this book is you're using practical skills as a detective who knows truth and loves truth, and asking people to do the same kind of Jesus. So in terms of your method of communicating the gospel in this fresh way, many people have said, can you just talk about what you do to help secular people view Jesus as a person of interest in your book?
Well, all the things that mattered to me most as an atheist, and I was a really committed artist. I mean, so my background's in design, my bachelor's degree in design, I have a master's degree in architecture, and then I joined the police department because my dad was a cop, and so I just thought it was a good, honorable job. I also knew that my creative side would probably consume me, because creativity is that way, right? It's very self-directed. I mean, you want to express yourself creatively, so
Right. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
very self-focused. And I just felt like it wouldn't be a great job to raise a family, and to be honest with you. But I grew up with that Brady Bunch where that dude was an architect, right? So,
Right.
so I always thought, this is, but the point I'm trying to make is, I just knew I needed to move in a different direction. But the things that mattered to me as an atheist back then were literature, the arts, and music. This is true for a lot of atheists. Education, science. I grew up in that generation that landed on the moon, and we thought that every potential question you could have about life, every obstacle you'd ever need to hurdle, you could probably do it with science.
Right.
And if you didn't have an answer, just wait. You'll figure it out. There's no reason to jump to God.
Right. There's a faith in science for sure.
Yeah, sure. And I thought it was well placed. So I just let it, that's who I was. Well, it turns out I just had no idea that all of those things are standing on the shoulder of a worldview inaugurated by Jesus of Nazareth that opened the door to the kind of robust educational life that I experienced. I had, I've got 2 master's degrees. I mean, this is something that was important to me. Mm-hmm. Education was important to me. My son, Jimmy, who's writing on our website, he's getting his master's in apologetics right now. Right. These were high values to us. Well, it turns out they are high values because we were raised in a world saturated by the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. And that's why I think Jesus matters, even to the secular world. It ought to matter because it turns out whatever you think is so important, it probably rests on a foundation built by Jesus and his followers.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I love that. Going back to your dad, one of the key themes that you sort of encircle in the book, you go for full circle on, is talking about what's true and whether it matters. And what I've found is just like your dad, many people say, well, as long as it makes me feel good, it doesn't matter if it's true. Or right. If it matters to me, then it's true for me, and that's good enough.
Good enough. Mm-hmm.
Right. How does this book or Person of Interest challenge that mindset when it comes to Jesus?
Yeah. So a lot of this is about is there anything beyond subjective evaluations? In other words, is history entirely a subjective? I mean, can I control what happened in history by the way I feel about it?
Nope.
But I think we have moved to a place where this seems to be the rule rather than the exception, right? Where people would say, well, no, that's your interpretation of history. Well, in the end, what I'm talking about, when I say that somebody bought this piece of land and built a house on it, I can go back and see if somebody bought that land, the names on the deed, and if the house was actually built by him, right? So there are some things that are true, whether I like them or not, whether I know anything about them or not. And this is what we're looking at when it comes to history, right? So in the end, the claims of history are going to be true or false based on our investigation. So, for example, if we said, did Christianity have any impact? Did the Christian worldview matter to the sciences? Well, I mean, I've got to demonstrate that to you, not just from how I like some Christians who are scientists. No, but I can actually go back and show you the number of scientific disciplines that were founded by Christians. And by the way, most of that data is hard to recover because the secular world has done a good job of scrubbing the Christian identities of the scientists of history. So we have to be able to kind of reconstruct that, right? And show why we believe, this guy was actually an Anglican priest, okay? And so nobody wants to talk about that, but that actually guided his thinking as a scientist. And these folks who were scientists wrote about Jesus as well. So I think in the end, you're right. I mean, we have to be able to ask the question, is everything in history, is everything outside of us really subject to our view of it and that we can actually change it? So if that was the case, can I use my mind to change whether or not 2 + 2 is equal to 4? But we're getting to that place where we're starting to ask that question.
Yep.
Right? Is that even fair to have? Is there anything objective about mathematics?
Right.
Is there anything objective about we've changed all of our titles. We've changed all of our names. We've changed all of our identity is fluid now. Right. So the question then becomes, is everything this way then? Right. Because then we're just in a battle of individuals, right? My view of history versus your view of history. Tell you what we'll do. I'll make a case for the view of history that I think is objective. Right. And then you can make a decision if the evidence is strong enough for it. That's why, honestly, I never typically will say, I'm going to prove something to you. Mm-hmm. I'll typically say, I'm going to show you the evidence that I think is compelling. So this is a reasonable inference from that evidence. Right. Because I know in the end, proof is something that you're going to have to make a decision about. Right. So these books we try to research them and we try to give you all the citations for them. And then you can make an assessment. Is the evidence strong enough to support my conclusion?
Yeah, no, and that's important because, again, some of the critics of Christian apologetics seem to accuse us of saying, well, we've proven God or we've proven this. Well, I like what you said, and that's what every court case does, right? They can't have 100% proof when that jury or that judge is making a
Right.
decision. They're
Right.
saying, what is the evidence pointing to? What's the reasonable case? Have the prosecution proven beyond a reasonable doubt?
Right.
That kind of language, right? And that should be the same application we have with the facts about Jesus.
Yeah, it's what's the most reasonable inference, and it's not what's possible, because what's possible is unreachable. It
Right.
really is, because there's too many possible doubts or imaginary doubts. And that's what the judges will typically call this to a jury here in
Mhm.
America. And in California, we'll say, okay, you have to get beyond. You cannot hang on possible doubts, because the judge will say, I could offer a possible or imaginary doubt
Right.
about anything. So
Absolutely.
we have to stay with what's reasonable, and reasonable is what is supported by evidence. And of course, the more substantial the evidence is, the better, the more reasonable the inference. But here's the problem: is that most of us, don't. I wish I could say, well, there's like a system in place, like a Bayesian formula, and we just plug in all the possibilities, and we do the equation, and we pop out at a conclusion, and we unfortunately a lot of times our decisions personally are based as much on our background, our preferences, our personal histories, our likes, our dislikes, our presuppositions. And this is why we have a voir dire process. When we just don't say, hey, first 12 people who get in the box, you're in.
Mhm.
No, we actually ask good questions, because we know that so much of the decision-making process
Right.
is influenced by these non-evidential factors.
Right.
And we're trying to find people who either have less of those biases or
Right.
presuppositions or inclinations, and or who say, yeah, I've got those, because everyone's got them, but I'm willing to shelve them long enough to be fair about this evidence. And at
Mhm.
least we want them all to know that you have to at least state for us your desire to shelve your biases and presuppositions and desires long enough to be fair about the evidence. We want you to go in with that mindset, because we know that so much of decision making is not about evidence. So much of
Well,
decision making is about your innate
right.
biases.
Are you intellectually honest enough to understand that you have these biases? Are you intellectually honest enough to want to know the truth despite your biases? I think those
That's
are
right.
all good points to make, especially in this generation where we're trusting only the people who already agree with us to provide us information. That whole,
Yeah. No,
social
there's no
media
doubt.
feed and that kind of stuff.
Well, look what we just done. We now are so. I'm watching on Twitter today the latest variation of the coronavirus. How many
Right.
people are pushing back and believe, for one reason or another, that the science is being weaponized by a political party or
Right.
okay,
On
so
both sides, right? On
on
both
both
sides.
sides, both sides. And so I'm concerned, because what I don't want us to do is to abandon certain important disciplines because we think they are too political.
Right.
And by the way, everything is going to become political. Everything. So don't think religion became political in the last 8-10 years.
Oh
Okay, so are you going to abandon religious belief because you think it's politicized? Are you going to abandon the pursuit of the sciences because you think that they're politicized? I mean, every single thing is. There are people who don't even want to watch commercials. There are people
yeah.
who don't want to watch the halftime at the football games because they feel like everything has been politicized.
Yeah.
Well, we're
And
going to have to abandon everything if that's the case. We have to be, I think, as Christians, we have to be able to be discerning
right.
and be willing to. I'm not going to abandon my interest in the sciences just because someone might be using some branch of the sciences to advance their own side, because both sides are doing that. So I'm just going to, again, I think the science doesn't, like Frank Turk and I always say, the science doesn't tell you anything, scientists do.
Right.
So
That's
I'm
good.
looking at the science and trying to be as objective as I can. I don't pay a lot of attention to what talking heads in the sciences say. Just show me the data and then I can make my own decision.
Now, in terms of the other side of it, because I think that's important what you've just talked about, with especially with presuppositions, there's a set of Christians, some of them here in Canada, who actually argue we shouldn't even show evidence to non-believers. We should only assume the Bible is true, and when we argue for Christianity, it's with the presumption that the Bible is a fact, and atheists who reject that are living in contradiction with what they believe. Now, how do you respond to this presuppositional idea? Not all presuppositional arguments are false, I don't think. But
No,
this one in particular that says if you use evidence for non-Christians, that is sinful. How would you respond to that, especially in light of your book?
well, that's what Mormons do. That's the Mormon approach.
Mhm.
If you think about it, you don't have a lot of evidentialist Mormons because they
That's true.
cannot make their case evidentially. They instead presume that the Book of Mormon is true. And if you will simply read and ask God, pray about it, read the whole thing and pray about it, God will reveal to you that it is true. There is no other way I mean, I don't know how, couldn't I take the exact same approach? The exact same. Now, of course, I think the presuppositionalists will say no, but how would I differentiate? How would I explain to the Mormon that his trust, his presuppositional trust in the Book of Mormon is unwarranted?
Right.
I'd have to start to become an evidentialist.
Right.
I'd have to start to figure out, like, how do I, now you can argue that there's maybe, as a presuppositionalist, I could take certain approaches with the Mormon that are not evidential, but I've been in those conversations. I'll take the exact same approach with you. Remember, their view is that you are unwarranted in the way you've accepted your Bible, because Joseph restored it. The plain and precious truths of Scripture were lost and corrupted. And it's only through a right interpretation restored to us by Joseph Smith that we can even know what those passages mean.
Right.
I just don't know that this would work. This has that kind of power. And this is one of the reasons why I'm an evidentialist, because I have a Mormon family. And when I first started becoming interested in God, they presented the Book of Mormon to me. As a matter of fact, they had missionaries come to our door. I read through the entire Book of Mormon before I read the Old Testament. Okay. And so I knew the Book of Mormon said. I really didn't know what was true. So I started to take an evidential approach. And I realized that evidential approach will not only confirm for you that the Gospels are telling us something reliable about Jesus of Nazareth, but they will also confirm for you that they'll protect you from error. Right. Because the same approach that I took with the New Testament, if you take that same approach, the four things we talk about in eyewitness reliability, oh my gosh, the Book of Mormon falls apart really quick. So you cannot confirm the Book of Mormon using the same techniques we use to ask the question, this dude who testified to this 45 years ago and now he's dead, and I don't even have access to the guy who wrote the report because he's now dead too. How do I trust what this guy said 45 years ago, and I can't interview him anymore, and I can't even interview the report writer anymore? That approach you take with the Book of Mormon, and trust me, it does not work. And they know that. They know that there's not that's why most people come out of Mormonism over a long period of time struggling with what they've learned in Mormon history, struggling with what they've learned about the fact set related to the Book of Mormon, Doctrines and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price. Right. Those books eventually fall apart. So that's why I think in the end, I don't take a presuppositional approach, because I don't think that would get you out of Mormonism.
Yeah. Well, and at the end of the day, the fact that Jesus came as a human being and then died publicly on a cross and was resurrected with witnesses tells me that God himself is using evidence to speak to them.
Well, and this is why I wrote a book called Forensic Faith. I knew this question was big, right? This question was, I was going around talking about the evidence for God from God's crime scene. I wrote a book called God's Crime Scene, and the evidence for Christianity from Cold Case Christianity. I realized that a lot of places I was going, I needed to make a case first for why we should make a case, because people didn't see, again, they would say either we're acting sinfully to even show any of, well, really? Have you read the New Testament? This is everything that Jesus did at every stop. Why even do miracles? Why would he say, if you don't believe what I'm telling you, believe on the evidence of the miracles I've worked in front of you? He said that, okay? I'm not making that up. He spent 40 days with the disciples after the resurrection in Acts 1, giving them many additional convincing proofs. That's in the Greek, a word we use to describe evidence. Evidence. When John the Baptist comes back and his disciples say, John, he wants to know, are you the one? He's in custody. Really? You could have had a very presuppositional response. That's not what he does. He says, go tell John what you saw here. The deaf can hear, the blind can see. In other words, the miracles were the indirect evidence that demonstrated his deity. And by the way, when he tells John the Baptist, or Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, that, hey, blessed are those who have not seen yet believe, keep reading. Yeah. Because they will have trusted what you told them, Thomas, because I'm going to send you as an eyewitness. That's called direct evidence. No, you're not going to avoid the use of evidence by Jesus. Jesus was a very committed evidentialist. And that's what I write about in Forensic Faith.
If you put your finger in Jesus, scar on the side of his body,
why do you need to do that?
Well, you're not going to deny his existence or his resurrection.
Right. Why even offer that? Why offer this as what? As evidence?
Yeah.
Okay, this is the problem, is that if you look at just how Jesus, he would go into your town, he would heal before he would herald.
Right. That's really good.
Why? Because those miracles testified to his authority. Those miracles set the table. They were evidence, like he says in John, I think chapter 10, chapter 14, over and over again. If you don't believe what I'm telling you, at least believe on the evidence of the miracles I worked in front of you. I did that for a reason.
Well, we're excited. We have people online waiting to ask questions, which we're glad to have them for the first time. So we'll just take a little break here, just play a little commercial, and then we're going to get to those questions, Jim.
Builders know that if you want a structure to stand the test of time, it must be built from a firm foundation. This Giving Tuesday, join people from around the world in generosity and support FBB's foundational programming like free webinars, our brand new Engage Camp, and Be Ready conferences, and so much more. On November 30th, support Faith Beyond Belief Build for an amazing 2022 of training the saints to defend their faith in everyday conversations. Give today at faithbeyondbelief.ca.
All right, so we're going to take some questions here, Jim, and I'm excited to hear what our audience is thinking. So I'm going to be admitting you, Doug, if you're listening in, and just probably give him a few seconds here.
There he is. Oh, I know Doug.
Okay. Doug had a few questions, so Doug, maybe if you can focus on one, and then if we have time, we can go on a second one if you can hear us. You'll need to unmute, Doug, and you'll be able to chat with Jim here. Hey, Doug. How's it going?
There he is.
Okay, I think I got it now.
You're in. We can hear you. Go ahead, Doug.
Hi, Jim. I'm actually, I'm on your course for a person of interest. So
excellent. I recognize your name, so that's good. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, the last one you tried that, but and you did a pretty good job.
Thanks.
Anyways, the one I had a few questions, but the one I think is important is your audience. For us that are trying to possibly do this as a ministry in our churches. And so I know I've seen some of your videos where you speak to, we don't always lose our youth in post-secondary, we start losing them in high school already.
Yeah.
But given where society's going nowadays, I'm even wondering if for us junior high is like grade 7 to 9 even, right? Like, they're getting so exposed to many things socially nowadays, and I know you have the kids' books and all that kind of stuff, but I'm wondering if the full books, what's your range of where we should approach that in the church if we're doing a ministry there?
Okay, I'll be honest. I think it's scary. I think it's the age of doubt and skepticism and exposure to all kinds of alternative worldviews has clearly dropped. It's much lower than it was in my generation, because I would typically not encounter, even my local community held a set of kind of uniform beliefs probably that were reflected in the school. That's probably changing and it's so fluid now, it's probably changing on a minute by minute basis. Not only that, the first skepticism I would see outside the primary influence of my friends and my family would have been in college. So I would have been 17, 18, 19 years old. Now, of course, the minute we give our kids one of these, and we're doing that at a very young age. That's why when we wrote kids' books, we had possibilities. What age range are we writing those for? So the adult books have a kids version that's 8 to 12. And the reason why we picked 8 to 12, if you think about it, that's the 3rd grade to the 6th grade.
Right. I
think that's when we got to reach them. I think that when your kids, what I notice is if you're running a Sunday school, you already know this. If you have a 4th grader, and matter of fact, I was doing a conference for the Arkansas Southern Baptist Convention in Arkansas. And so I'm there doing this, and we're at the book table, and the same afternoon, 2 people came up to me. The first one was a woman who was teaching 3rd or 4th graders. She said, one of the questions my kids have is, why does Satan do it this way? And he talks about something that Satan did. Later in the day, somebody came in from like a 7th grade, 6th, 7th grade class. She said that one of the questions I have to struggle with is, why do we believe there's a Satan? And if you see that subtle shift, when you're in the 4th grade class, there's the assumption that there's a Satan, but why does he work a certain way? But by the time you get to the 7th grade, there's the assumption that there's a Satan. That's gone. We're not even sure there's a Satan anymore. And that's the shift that's taking place because of our digital exposure. So I actually think that it's elementary school, upper elementary, where we have to do heavy lifting. Because by the time, or you just say, tell you what, we're not going to give you this thing. We're going to give you a flip phone until you get your own phone. I'll pay for your flip phone so you can, text people, and so you can get home and that kind of stuff. You can call me in an emergency, but I'm not giving you a smartphone. Now, all that does is push that experience off to tablets and laptops, because our kids are eventually going to be online. So I don't know if you can protect them from that. But I think you have to start way earlier than you ever did before. When we wrote a book called So the Next Generation Will Know, Sean McDowell and I did some research on this. There's good reason to believe that age, it used to be like 85% of Christians would become Christians by the age of 18. Only about 15% more become Christians after 18. This used to be a statistic. There's good reason to believe that's dropped to around 12.
Right.
And that's why I think we need to start way earlier. If you said, oh yeah, and my kids are going to a Christian high school, and they do 2 years of apologetics in this junior and senior year. So when they go to college, that's so late. It's way too late. By the time they're in the junior year, they've already, like most people who are not Christians, when they are in college, when you ask them, why are you, when did you leave Christianity? They'll tell you 10 to 17. Right. 10 to 17. If you're waiting until 17 in your senior year to talk about why Christianity is true, you've missed it by 7 years. This is why we got to start a lot earlier. And I think this is, it may be sad, but it is true. By the way, I got just the cop in me has zero patience for this now. Okay. Because I think that most of you who are listening to this, you've already catechized your kids in several other things that you think are important. Right. You have. Here in Southern California, I always use this analogy because we have so many sports teams here. We have rivalries here. You're either a Clippers or a Lakers fan. You're either a Dodgers or an Angels fan. You're either a Kings or a Ducks fan. You're either a Rams or a Charger fan. And those folks who are in one side of those two teams, we have 2 teams for everything. They can tell you why the other team is a bunch of losers. They can tell you why their team, they've already catechized their kids. They will wear those jerseys. They'll wear those jerseys when it's like, this is the family. Look, we are split in our family between USC and UCLA, Trojans and Bruins, big rivalry here. We just had last couple of weeks ago, we had a game a week ago last Sunday, right? It's a big rivalry game. Oh, trust me. My kids know who's the backup quarterback. They know all those people. Who's the best running back on that team? Why don't they start the other guy? We've already taught these things to our kids, but then you ask the question, well, how do I make a case for the existence of demons or angels or Satan? And we're dumbfounded. Well, I'll tell you what, let's just do this. Let's spend a little less time talking about trivial stuff that doesn't matter and spend some time talking about the stuff that does. Because I think in the end, we have no one to blame but ourselves as the parents. I'll take that blame. And I've got 4 kids, and there's a spectrum there of how committed they are to the gospel. They're still young, but there's a spectrum there. And I get that. If you've got kids, you probably experience the same thing. But they all were exposed the same way, and their choices they make now are their choices. But I took my time to expose that. By the way, I thought they had a question about the faith. They know they can ask me, and I'll probably have something to say, because this is the stuff I talk about and think about all the time. Whereas, if for a lot of us, if I had a question about the Dodgers, I know I could ask my dad because he knows the entire history of the Dodgers. There's a lot of stuff our kids know they can ask us about. I just don't think they think that the issues of faith are one of those things.
Doug, thank you so much. We need to move on, but thanks for being part of our call.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate you.
And we have, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but is it Nzinga? You're next, sir. Nzinga, is that right? Go ahead, unmute yourself, and you can ask your question. There you are.
How are you?
Good How's it going? Good to see you. Thanks for being part of our show today. Do you have your question ready?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Nzinga, and my question is related to the problem of evil.
Okay.
How can the presence of evil work for God's existence?
Okay, so that's a good philosophical question. And sometimes when people ask questions about the problem of evil, they're really hurting from something that's happened to them. And so I want to know if that's where this is coming from. With you, Nzinga, have you experienced something that has really shook you or troubled you, or you had something that was really hurtful that's happened to you? Is that where this question is coming from for you personally?
It's not exactly personally, although I had some situation in my family, but I've been sometimes in my personal evangelism. So I have this kind of questions like these, and I struggle to give some efficient answer for that.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that there's whenever I talk about the problem of evil and God's existence, and I have an entire talk I do on this, but it's a cumulative case kind of an approach. In other words, if you ask me, why did that 10-year-old get murdered the way she did? I get asked that question a lot because I've worked a lot on murdered 10-year-olds. So I get it. This is really hard to explain, but there's always a set of evidence, reasons why she died on that day that way. And I had to put that together cumulatively. I think there's also a cumulative set of reasons why God would allow something bad to happen to any of us. But before we even talk about that, we have to ask ourselves the question, why are we calling the murder evil to begin with? Is it just because we don't like it? Or do we think there's actually something objectively evil about what happened to her? In other words, because I guarantee you the person who did this to her didn't think it was evil at all.
Yes.
And I worked a lot of these serial kind of folks who just in their head, they think this is, she deserved it for some reason. They can justify it for one reason or the other. We would say there's something wrong with that person, that we think this is objectively evil, but there's the problem. If we think something is objectively evil, we have to have an objective standard by which we are measuring and calling it evil. If we're just saying, well, no, every culture that's not true. I mean, the rape of children, for example, some cultures will marry children at a very young age, at 10. We would say that's wrong. Well, not wrong to them. The cultures get to decide what's right or wrong. Because if that's the case, we really can't argue with another culture, especially if they outnumber us or outpower us. Now, we would say this is a truth that resides above both of our cultures. In other words, this is outside of us and our desire. And by the way, if an individual gets to decide it, it's subjective. A subject decides it. If a culture gets to decide it, it's still subjective. It's just a group of subjects. And there's the problem. We call things evil as though there's a standard of righteousness that's grounded objectively so that everyone ought to know this is evil. But that means we're borrowing from a theistic worldview, that there is an all-powerful God who is the standard of righteousness by which we measure anything that doesn't meet that standard as being unrighteous. And that's where I think that you can use evil as an evidence for, at least for this, for an objective standard of righteousness. And now you can make the arguments for why you think that objective standard of righteousness is actually God's nature.
Okay.
And Jim,
Right, so that's where I was going.
This is a good time, maybe, and thank you for your calling, Zinga. Why don't you let people know where they can find your talk and your resources and your book?
Yeah, so that talk about evil, I've written a lot about evil. Just Google the word evil at our website, coldcasechristianity.com. So the book I wrote on this was called God's Crime Scene, where I look at 8 attributes of the universe and argue that the best explanation for these 8 attributes is God. And one of those 8 attributes that I'm using as evidence for God is evil, because I think that we can explain why God would allow anything evil to happen, but you cannot really have true evil if there isn't a God who sets the standard. So the only question is not, well, how could there be a God if there's evil? No, how could there be evil if there's no God? The question is, why would God allow anything evil to occur? And that's where I think the cumulative case, that's where I think there's like 7 reasons why God allows evil in the world. And I'm happy to walk through those. But the point I'm trying to make is that's a much longer conversation. But we can't even begin to have that conversation unless we first agree there's a standard, an objective standard outside of our subjective opinion. And that's where I think most people are going to stumble. That's a big hurdle for a lot of people. And that's where I think we need to spend time arguing for, showing why that must be the case.
Zinga, thank you so much for your call.
Thanks,
I'm glad that you're being part of our call today. All right, our next person here, Jim, is Liz. Liz, you're getting on there just to make sure you unmute yourself. You're joining. Here you are. There you go. Liz, if you can just make sure you unmute yourself when the audio is ready.
I can see she's connecting.
Well, while we're waiting, Jim, can you just give us the URL for the website again?
So just coldcasechristianity.com is where I have all of our articles and all that stuff. And then for the book, it's personofinterestbook.com.
Perfect.
Hey, Liz, how are you? There we go.
Hi, sorry, am I next?
You're next.
Okay. Sorry, it's Liz. My question is, how would you respond to a skeptic or maybe an atheist being nice who claims that the things you say in your videos are all aimed at selling your books? There's no real truth or proof in it. You only want to sell your books.
Right. Well, that person who's saying that is probably on a YouTube channel on which they're getting advertising income. So the only reason why you're saying that about my books is because it develops an audience that you can then monetize with advertising. Do you see the problem with this? No, I'm not going to actually make that kind of a claim because I think it's fair for content creators like the YouTuber to actually build a big audience and then monetize. We don't have to watch, right? But if you do watch and you push through the advertising, you're going to get. By the way, you're going to get something from that person. It's a transactional kind of experience. I get that. And that's where we are as well. Now, I would always say, he'll probably say the same thing. If you're on YouTube, maybe there are some people with huge platforms making a ton of money on YouTube. I suspect there's not a lot of money to be made on YouTube. I could be wrong. But if you think there's a lot of money to be made in this weird little niche thing we call Christian apologetics, well, knock yourself out. Good luck with that. I don't make a living as an apologist. Because whatever I've made on books, and I've written 8 now, doesn't even get close to the little bit of money I make in my pension. My pension pays my bills. And what I do here in books is I didn't self-publish these. I'm taking a small percentage because the publisher gets most of the share of every book. But that's because I really just didn't want the hassle of trying to navigate that whole thing by myself. By the way, I am not a professional author. I mean, I'm making a living as a pension, as a detective. I'm a professional detective who never saw myself writing books, but I ended up writing books because I was with Sean McDowell training youngsters in Berkeley on a trip we used to take, an immersive trip we used to take. And Sean said, why don't you write a book about the stuff you're teaching the kids? And I said, I got 3 cases in trial right now. There's no way I have time for that. But my wife said, well, why not? If he can find us a publisher, then maybe you should write a book. You always wanted to write a book. As a kid, I wanted to be a journalist. So I said, okay, so that's how this whole thing started. I kind of backed into it. But I can tell you 8 books in, that all 8 books combined are way less than my pension, which pays the bills around here. And that's this. And I worked for that for 28 years to get a pension that would be. And by the way, I'm a compatibilist when it comes to financial freedom. Let me take financial independence. This is what I mean by that. I've always seen that financial independence is not the ability to buy anything. It's the ability to buy anything you want. And I don't want anything. So I attain financial independence really fast. So it turns out that if you just have a modest set of desires, I've been in this house for 30 years. I will die in this house. This is, my 2013 Hyundai is still sitting on the driveway. I will drive that car until the wheels come off. Okay. That's just how I am. I just don't really want anything. So that's how I think, but people don't know that. But it is pretty easy to say, hey, yeah, he's actually not concerned in the truth. By the way, if this stuff is not true, it doesn't go very far. And right, the reason why you're writing about history that I think is supported evidentially. And because it is true and supported evidentially, it has much broader reach than it would if I was writing stuff that is purely, clearly a lie about history. So in the end, what's really interesting too is that these are about inferences, right? Inferences from manuscript evidence. This is what we're doing in this business, is we're trying to say, hey, I think the traditional view is the correct view about God, about Jesus, about the New Testament. And so that's what I'm writing about. I'm just trying to defend something that I know is true. Here's what I have noticed. If you're willing to write about cultural issues, you will sell way more books. So you don't see me doing that. You don't see my videos doing that. I don't go online and Google and go, oh, the hottest thing is somebody said this today. Okay, here's my response video to that thing somebody said yesterday. That stuff goes viral.
I would watch that if you did that.
Yes. If all you're talking about is the evidence for this thing from 2,000 years ago, that's just the kind of bread and butter stuff that just is the substructure. I think it's upstream. of all the cultural issues. And that's why I think, is the Bible true? And should we take it seriously, are more important. But if you really wanted to have the best YouTube channel, if you really wanted to sell the most books, you will capitalize on that thing which is explosive and viral right now. And that's the thing that moves. And I just have avoided that because to me, that's not what's important. What's important is this niche thing that for the most part is not going to sell a bunch of books.
Liz, thanks so much for your question. We need to keep moving on, but thanks for being part of our conversation today. All right, so just a heads up, but Janie is actually on our board. I borrowed her copy of your book because I didn't have your copy yet.
Oh, good.
But she has a really good question as well. So,
okay,
Janie, when you get a chance to unmute, and...
well, she's on your board. She should know how to unmute so fast. Oh, there she is. Well, you're right. She's ready to go.
But she's a huge fan, Jim.
Oh, very cool.
Just make sure if you unmute Janie, you're still muted.
There you go.
There we go. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Janie. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for joining us.
So my question centers around being in conversation with someone and seeing an opportunity to talk about why Jesus matters. In a few sentences or list of points based on your book, how would you engage this person in continuing to talk about why Jesus matters? And how do I draw someone in so that I can give them more specific reasons, information, and facts that point to Jesus being the pivotal person of interest in all of history?
I think it's good questions. It's about asking good questions. This is what, a good friend of mine, Greg Kokel, I wish I had a percentage of every book he wrote on that tactics book was really, really important.
Yeah, I love that book too.
Yeah. So it's about asking good questions. And it's really about, I think, starting out by asking, like, what really matters to you? Because I don't have to make it, it turns out I don't have to persuade them that Jesus matters, because whatever matters to them is already proof that Jesus matters, because it's going to be one of those areas. It's going to be something that is going to fall in the cat. Oh, I love to read. Oh, well, literature. That now you're going to talk about, well, you ever thought about who is the one historical figure in history that's been written about more than any other historical figure?
Yeah.
By the way, what book are you reading? Oh, you're reading, is it fiction? What are the stories like? What's the actual nature of the characters? There's probably a good chance there's a Christ figure in the narrative somewhere, because this overarching story of the even if it's just posed as the underdog who came from a family where he didn't know his, there was some doubt about his heritage. These are overarching pieces of the Christ story that are pulled into fiction. And some of them are so dramatically, so precise that you can see that Jesus is the model from which we draw our inspiration. And this literature genre is called Christ figures. And you don't see these, there's no, what we were talking earlier, Jojo, about, is there a Luke Skywalker figures? No, it turns out that the figures that are in Star Wars, that are in the Matrix, they are all drawn from a overarching Christian worldview in which the shadow of the Jesus story reappears over and over and over again as Neo, as characters in Star Wars. It's not that figure is independent of Jesus. That figure would not be written the way he is if it wasn't for Jesus. And so it turns out that I don't have to spend time persuading people that Jesus matters. I simply need to uncover what matters to them. And then I know that probably it's going to be grounded in a Christian worldview. And I can show them that the thing they love so much is actually standing on Jesus's shoulders. And that's what this book tries to do. I'm not just going to, and again, I'm doing two things. Why does Jesus matter? What is his impact? That's number one. But number two, I'm going to shock you to show you how much of the Jesus story can be recovered from that area of impact. And that's something you're going to say that even if you said, oh, yeah, Abraham Lincoln was a really influential historical figure. Really? Can you recover everything that's publicly known about Abraham Lincoln from these aspects of human culture? No, you won't be able to do that. But you can with Christianity. You can with Jesus of Nazareth. You can recover the claims of the Gospels from like education, from just the buildings in which the top universities in the world were built. Those campuses contain the images, and in the book I'll show you how much you can recover of the Jesus story just from the top 15 campuses in the world. This is the areas that people, for the most part, don't even know how much impact he's had. So I would say is I wouldn't spend a lot of time trying to persuade people that Jesus over here is important. I'd say, what's important to you over there? It turns out it's already standing on Jesus.
So it's about asking them questions about
Asking
what
good
they're-
questions.
they're
What
interested in.
matters to you? Yeah.
And then saying, hey, that's Jesus.
Or you
Okay.
could even say that matters to me too, because I'm a Christian.
Okay.
You know,
Great.
and that's why it matters, because it turns out that even the fiction that could be very rough around. We're watching right now Ted Lasso on Apple TV. It's about an American football coach who goes over to Europe and becomes a soccer coach. And what's interesting about it is the tensions. It's vulgar. Okay. The language in it is entirely vulgar. You wouldn't look at this and say, boy, a Christian wrote that. But what you would look at it, you'd say, oh, there's something Christian in the substructure of the story. It clearly has a Western influence that's been given to it from Christianity. And it's hard to deny in places where it talks. I mean, there's so many ways. And I've seen some Christian bloggers actually write about Ted Lasso. But my point is that the show itself is quite vulgar. And if you, for example, met somebody who was like, oh, yeah, I'm watching Ted Lasso. Really, wasn't it interesting? You could talk about the characters in that show and how they're derivative of a Christian worldview. And that's the kind of stuff I think we need to be able to do, is to not start where we are, but start where they are.
Yeah, it is interesting how people tend to put those kinds of things into their stories, even if they're not Christian. It's almost like it's ingrained in us, in our DNA, right?
Yes. Well, and look, there's actually been studies done. I actually cite some in one of the chapters of the book that talk about how early theistic belief is formed. It's not, and as a matter of fact, these are not Christians doing the studies. These are non-Christian secularists doing the studies in Ivy League schools, and they're discovering that it turns out, they'll say it's bred in the bone, or it's in the genes, quote unquote. In other words, that our default position is not atheism or agnosticism. Our default position is a form of theism, because we look at a created world and we see design features, and as children, we infer the existence of a designer from what we interpret as design features. And so our default position is, this is why I think still 84% of people on planet Earth believe in some form of a higher power. Well, that's just because this is our default position. You actually have to be talked out of that position.
Yeah. Children get it. It's very simple.
Yes, this is why I think Jesus says that you should come to me,
Yes.
right? These children come to me, not because they're stupid or uninformed. Are they uninformed compared to us? Of course. But it's because they're humble enough not to assume they know the answer before they hear it.
Right.
They are still capable of bending their knee. And there's the difference, I think. We've lost that ability.
You're right.
Yeah.
Jenny, I
Thank
don't
you.
want to cut you off because you're on my board, but we have to get.
That was great. Thank you for the conversation.
Thanks, Janie. Appreciate you.
So we're gonna just be wrapping up here, Jim, and I want to give you one more chance to speak, because one of the points that was asked several times in questions, and I'd love if you could just maybe tie this in as I give you the chance to speak your last word here, but the amount of research you did. All kinds of little facts from, the song that Beyonce did to this obscure like Greek scholar sometime.
Yeah, I know.
8th century, right? How did you get all that in it? And what is it that we'll get if we get this book?
Okay, so a lot of that comes down to, like having good people in your life who will say, hey, look over there for that. And so I kind of thank some of these people in my forward. It was people like Richard Howe, from SES, Southern Evangelical Seminary.
Yeah.
David Wood, who's done a lot of work on Islam, places like things like that. Frank Turek, an apologist. Yeah. And Amy Hall from Stand to Reason. Amy was the person who probably helped me shape wordsmith more than any other person. That's just wordsmithing. Amy's brilliant. There's lots of places where the words there, I wish I could say they were mine. I've said this before publicly. A lot of it is her. She's just an excellent wordsmither. She takes my words and says, have you thought about saying it like this? Yeah. But also Gary Habermas, a lot of the stuff in literature. But I had two research assistants, Caleb Nelson and Sam Bodner. And these are folks who came to me by way of email and said, hey, do you ever need any help in anything? I'd like to help with your nonprofit. Well, I don't have a nonprofit.
Right.
But if you'd like to do some research, I could use some help in these areas. And a lot of this is going to be, well, can you go out and find for me and I had a partial list, but I needed to know what's the complete list. At least it's never going to be complete because so much of their religious identity is hidden. But I wanted to know the scientists. We identified 950 scientists who held a Christian worldview, and I needed information on those. So here's what we have. The book is about 250 pages, I think. There's about 50 pages of endnotes. But there's a link in the endnotes to 279 pages of endnotes. So the endnotes are, about 325 pages compared to 250 pages of the book. So here's how I look at it. When you make a case in front of a jury, you spend 10 weeks. And if you had to stack the evidence you presented over those 10 weeks, it would fill up the entire room. But when it comes to the closing argument, you're going to have a few hours,
Right.
if you're lucky.
Yeah.
And you got to hold their attention. You're not going to get 10 weeks to go over the 10 weeks of stuff you talked about.
Right.
You're going to have 3 hours to summarize the 10 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, that's what books are. They're closing arguments, but the endnotes are the 10 weeks worth of evidence.
Right.
So I wanted to include that, but I knew that if I wrote a book like that, it would be one of those books that nobody would have a conversation about, right? And we want to be conversational. We want to be able to throw the ball in a way that people can catch it. And that's what I would say to anyone who's listening. And this is why I'm so glad you're doing a series like this. So glad this is the mission of your ministry, because it turns out that I remember the first year I ever attended the Evangelical Theological Society, I was blown away by how smart people were. I'm so proud of the Christian philosophical and theological community because we are deep. And we got great thinkers. But at the same time, I knew that those kinds of conversations are never going to happen in an airplane. Instead, it's these kinds of conversations where you're able to take and synthesize these bigger ideas and throw them in a way, right across the center of the plate, no spin on it, about 40 miles an hour, give you enough time to smack it hard. And that's what we're trying to do with these ideas, right? Is just throw it across the center of the plate at about 40 miles an hour. And that's the kind of thing that we can do if we, by the way, you have to know how to throw it at 100 to throw it well in order to be able to back it off at 40. So I want us to have a deep knowledge of what is true, but we got to remember, we got to take off some of the speed when we're throwing the ball. And that's what we're trying to do here.
Well, Jim, it's been great. If you could just give us your website one more time for those who want to get the book, and I really highly recommend it, even just for references, like you said. I'm keeping my copy so I can actually go back and check those references. I started going through the notes at the back when I finished reading the book, and I'm like, no, I need to keep this. This is a great quote kind of thing that
I know. And they're not my quotes. They're quotes from people who are great thinkers. Right. Yeah, I get you. Yeah. So you can find more about it at Person of Interest Book, personofinterestbook.com. And by the way, we have a children's academy. It's designed for kids 8 to 12. It's called casemakersacademy.com. So that's where we have all kinds of downloadable materials and videos that hopefully you can, 3 years of, 3 separate curriculums to get you through with your kids if you're homeschooling. So hopefully it's helpful.
You were a youth pastor too, so you actually
and we homeschooled, so we always looking for inexpensive curriculum. So
and you can find some of those resources if you contact Faith Beyond Belief as well at faithbeyondbelief.ca. Especially if you're in Canada, we'd love to chat with you and talk to you. I know I didn't get a chance to get everyone's question, but we're glad that you participated. And if you liked this format, we are doing another one with a PhD student named Logan Gates. He's excellent. He's actually speaking on Christmas, and can we still find Christ? Is God still with us at Christmas time, especially in an increasingly secular culture? So that's coming up. If you want to join us for that, that's going to be on. I just want to make sure you got the right date here, December 8th. At 5 p.m. Mountain Time. And again, Jim, we're just so blessed to have you. Thanks for being part of our first call-in show. Hopefully it went well, and hopefully you can come back.
That was super smooth. I appreciate you having me. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Oh, and one more thing. We have a book winner. Thanks, Heather. She's my person here. Our book winner today is Sarah Taylor. So thanks for your question. We didn't get a chance to. We covered some of it, but at least now you have a copy of the book. So contact us about how you can get that. God bless you all. Thank you, Jim. We'll chat soon.
Thanks again.